Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Now, this video is again about contemporary art. It's the second video, and if you haven't seen the first one, I encourage you to watch it, because in it we ask some very basic questions that relate directly to making art since the late 19th century. And what we said, really, very briefly, again, you might want to go and watch it, it's not that long. What we said really is that one of the first questions is to do with the nature of representation. To represent. What does that mean, to represent something? By representing, we mean showing to others what either one or many people see. And as we saw, one of the questions is to do with, should I represent something that everybody can agree on is that thing, or do I only have a duty to my artistic self, my personal self, my own identity? And if nobody recognizes my representation of what I see, does it matter? The second sort of principle we saw very clearly is contained in that little sentence, which is that the thing represented is not the thing itself. And that separation between the real and the representation of the real, whatever the real is, of course, is crucial in modern art. So, from the little that we saw last time, and those few paintings we looked at, we can already understand three things. First of all, that towards the end of the 19th century, there was a movement from figurative to abstract, where the issue of likeness, the issue of resemblance to nature, as it were, is not the main aim anymore. Anyone can do that in the sense of, by the end of the 19th century, of course, photography is very firmly established. Portraits through photography are extremely common, and therefore painters have long realized, of course, that if photography can represent exactly after nature, what then should the role of painting be? Now, of course, until the end of the 19th century, art was mostly figurative, that is, imitative of reality, of an agreed upon reality. So, if I paint the portrait of a famous person, or even a non-famous person, it is very important that my portrait represents that person in such a way that anybody who knows that person in real life can recognize them. If I paint a famous landscape or a famous object in a landscape, the Eiffel Tower, for example, well, the agreed upon idea here is that I should represent something that anybody can see immediately is the Eiffel Tower if they've seen it before. If I decide to represent the Eiffel Tower in the form of an elephant, and I say this is the Eiffel Tower, then obviously people will not see it, because it doesn't look like an elephant in the real world, of course. And so they will have to accept that my representation of the Eiffel Tower is going sideways, and maybe that's the occasion for them to ask, what on earth is he doing? So, again, the agreed upon principle until 19th century is that there should be a good match, as good a match as possible, between the thing in the world and my representation of that thing. Of course, we should not forget that for many, many centuries, art was also a message carrier. It had a communication value that is certainly, you remember, the Renaissance and way afterwards as well. Paintings were commissioned, of course. And so they carried very often religious, biblical messages, but not only, of course, power-related messages and the like. Of course, this idea of paintings being true to nature is, of course, very old. And here I can remind you of what Leonardo da Vinci said in his notebooks. There are that have been published in book form. And in those notebooks, he says somewhere that of painting and poetry, painting is the greatest art because it produces images of nature truer than poetry's. In other words, painting is greater because when it represents nature, it is more precise, more exact, more realistic, and poetry can only evoke. Now, we also start to see, of course, in the 19th century, a different kind of realism, because Leonardo might be right, I don't know, but the question is immediately, well, what kind of reality do you show? What kind of real world do you actually represent in those paintings? And certainly in the 19th century, we saw a different kind of realism in that sense, where the subjects themselves become more true to life. And you remember from last video that Manet painting about horses, and we said those horses are in a way less true to life because we don't recognize their feet and all that, but in many ways, and probably in the most important ways, those Manet horses are much truer to life because they are moving, because they are the excitement and the speed of the race. So we see here a different kind of realism coming at about the same time. We see David here on the left, and then Millet. Now, David is linked, of course, to a tradition where paintings exalted the greats or the great, endeavors and ambitions. And Millet here looks to an art that would show kind of everyone and only the lucky few. So realism here in the sense of, in more sort of Zola-like sense, that is the realism of everyday life and not the realism of the life of the very few. And that immediately calls upon another question, which is fundamental to art, of course, but not only contemporary art, which is, well, what is a good subject for art? And of course, for centuries, the only good subjects, again, were either high-born or religious subjects. But increasingly from the 19th century, and certainly after, it becomes a real question. What is a good subject for art? That is, what should, what can, what should, what must art show? Actually, it's a very good question. If you look at theater, in French theater in the 18th century, it's very clear that what theater could represent was, you could not represent everything, nor could you represent all layers of societies, nor could you have any character speak in any old way. Everything has to be really ordered. So art could show life, but a very limited type of life. Historically, of course, art was always represented or stood for a few powerful or rich or socially important people. But the question really is, why should it still be the case? And in that sense, the realism is also very interesting when you take a sidestep, and I know very little about those things, to be honest, but this is from a Busali little book on Chinese painting. And he quotes Hu Li, a 17th century Chinese painter, apparently a very famous critic and somebody who knew European art really well. And he said that his problem with Western painting was that the West seeks too much to render the external appearance of forms. And that is very interesting, of course. Chinese painting is known for its evocative qualities, its wonderful paintbrush and the like, but it is never in the exactitude of the traits of a person, of a landscape. It is again in a combination of lines and space and colors. In other words, this Wu Li quote is also questioning that link between representation and the real thing itself. That is something that is encapsulated perhaps most famously, it's very debatable of course, in Van Gogh, the Dutch painter from the end of the 19th century. And Van Gogh in his letters, in a letter to his brother, I think, says, and I quote, "If one takes realism in a sense of literal truth, namely exact drawing and local colors, well, there are other things than that. All academic figures are constructed in the same way, and let us say on peut mieux, meaning irreproachably faultless. You will guess what I'm driving at. Those figures do not reveal to us anything new. What he means, of course, here, and that is partly, perhaps wholly behind his approach to colors, his approach to shapes, is if he sees a bedroom in yellow tones, that is what he paints. Have you never seen a bedroom painted yellow? Perhaps not. Maybe nobody has seen one before. But the point is that Van Gogh is asking, well, what is realism? What is to represent something? And if I represent something in my own way, then perhaps I reveal something new to you. But if I represent it in a way you expect, then I do not reveal anything new to you at all. So this movement from figurative to abstract towards the end of the 19th century is really an answer to the question, what is a representation when there is kind of an agreed upon form of things, yet that thing takes so many shapes that I could represent it in 1,000 ways. And what is an artist's duty? Is it to represent an agreed upon reality, an object in the world, or is it to express an internal vision that may not be shared? The second important aspect of this change towards the 19th century, the end of the 19th century, is basically sort of an increased self-reflexivity of artists and art. That is, that the arts are beginning to think about themselves and to theorize themselves as well, so that art becomes an artistic and theoretical subject as much as objects realized in the world, be it in the form of a novel or of a symphony or a painting or whichever art installation. That's what our dear Susan Sontag said, and I quote, in 1965, Sontag. Most artists and critics, I think it's in the her little essay on kitsch, but I'm not sure anymore. Most artists and critics have discarded the theory of art as representation of an outer reality in favor of the theory of art as subjective expression. Now, this increased theorizing, as it were, or this increased conceptual thinking about the arts is really at the basis, is the foundation of many of the artistic expressions that we've seen since then. They all encapsulate a different way to answer those really big questions about what is representation, what is real, what if we don't see the same thing when we look at the same object, and should art represent what Sontag calls an outer reality, or should they represent a subjective expression? And the third really important moment, as it were, or evolution at the end of the 19th century is, a bit before as well, of course, but certainly towards the end of the 19th century and very much after, concerns the question of the function of art. And the function of art changed. So if you think back here to temples, Greek temples, or portraits even of people, again, the function at the time was either a temple was first a temple. It may have been constructed in an aesthetically pleasing way, but it was not art as such. It became art later. A temple had a function, and it was to be a temple. A church had a function, it had to be a church. And the shape of the church and the aesthetic qualities of a church were all in the name of gratitude, as it were, to a god. A portrait represented somebody, and it was very much, in fact, done, and the trend in the 18th century, 19th century even, to send portraits of oneself to acquaintances and family. So it's not new. We didn't have to wait until photography for people to collect photos of the stars of the day. Voltaire had many portraits sent around to people who wanted them. But towards the end of the 19th century, the function of art changed. It was not simply to represent, again, something that anybody could recognize, or to have an external function like a temple. Suddenly, art became just art for art's sake, as the famous 19th century phrase go, of course, l'art pour l'art, that is, l'art, the art exists only to be art. It should not be concerned with social, political, representational expressions. It should be concerned with itself only. Of course, it's not only that, the function of art. There is a very, very famous, much later of course, but a very famous Jean-Paul Sartre text on should artists have a social and political role. But that's not even that, really. It's more to do with the fact that art didn't have to represent something for the sake of just representing it. And this increased personalization, this increased importance given to the vision and the individuality of the artist became primary, and the rendering, the representing of surface reality, external, outer reality, became very much secondary. And so here we have a complete shift, of course, and that shift is partly to do, as I'm sure you know, with the fact that increasingly artists were creating without being commissioned to do so. You all know that Michelangelo, for example, was commissioned, Raphael was commissioned, that is, they were asked to paint something specific about a specific subject with a specific number of figures, and these figures, not those figures, and then they were free to do it in their own aesthetically personal way, but they were commissioned to do something. They were not creating out of nothing for themselves. Van Gogh creates for himself, and so many of the artists at that period created only for themselves, then were hoping to sell the paintings. Famously, Matisse, I think, sold his first painting when he was 40 or something crazy. He'd been painting for years and years, and he just couldn't sell anything, but he kept creating his own art, of course, and afterwards it picked up. We have to quote Susan Sontag, although we're not quoting Susan Sontag. In her diaries, early diaries, Reborn, she quotes Jackson Pollock, the painter we saw in the last video. And Jackson Pollock said something which I think is very pertinent here. I am interested in expressing, not illustrating my emotions. And so Pollock reminds us here again that there is a difference between representations, real thing, representation on an agreed upon object and vision, and the personal life of the artist. He wants to express his emotions. He's not trying to illustrate them. He's not trying to show you his emotions in recognizable forms. It's up to you to work it out from his expression of his emotions. All this, of course, takes place in what implicitly we all know. That is that art is created on the ruins, or perhaps, I don't know, on the temple of previous art. That's what Gombrich, Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, says. Each generation, he says, is at some point in revolt against the standards of their fathers. Each work of art derives its appeal to contemporaries, not only from what it does, but also from what it leaves undone. Each work of art is related by imitation or contradiction to what has gone on before. And so it's not surprising to see an evolution in, for example, painting, but in all the arts, considering that, of course, when you are 20, you are looking for a way to supersede your ancestors, not simply to imitate them. Certainly in the West, this increased individualism since, let's say, the Renaissance, has certainly led to the development of an artist, as Pollock says, expressing but not illustrating his emotions. So, of course, all those things are linked to financial conditions, to, again, the commissioning and having an object, a subject, and a message imposed on you. And all those have slightly added to new freedom on the part of the artists in general, and it gave them license really to represent not only how they saw things, however else other people saw them, but also to represent all types of people, all types of landscapes, all types of ideas, scenes, subjects. And that reminds us also that art is never dissociated really, and again, I know art for art's sake, but that's a short-lived thing in many ways. It's important to remember that art is not dissociated from the real world, of course, and artists, they needed to be financed in order to create. We know that, we've just said that, but equally, for example, the great French historian Michel Pastoureau reminds us that what freed some of those painters, like Van Gogh, for example, Van Gogh is always, in his letters, always going on about a painter needs to go outside, a painter needs to be in nature, to paint nature. It's not natural to stay in your room and paint from there. And Pastoureau reminds us that, Van Gogh was also, in a way, enabled to do so, not because of artistic concepts or philosophical musings, but quite simply because portable paint in tubes was invented around that time, a little bit before that time, half 19th century. And before that, of course, paint would dry excessively quickly, so you could not paint outside, you always had to paint inside, in a sort of sheltered environment. But from the invention of paint in tube, then people like Van Gogh were enabled then to simply go outside, take their paint with them, and paint in life. And that very simple, in a way, chemical, commercial development had a profound effect on painting and the nature of painting itself, because the moment you can go outside and represent what is right in front of your eyes and not from memory or from drawings, then the immediacy of the paint or the painting gesture is completely different from that of your ancestors 100 or 200 years ago. So to close off today's episode, as it were, on contemporary art, we can say that we've identified two main issues so far, which are distinct, but of course strongly determined. The first issue is an issue of representation. So what does a painting represent? How does one represent life or movement in painting, but also in literature? To what degree is what I see true? To what degree is what I see real? And really, should it be real? Should it be true to nature? I picked up that one in Somerset Maugham's book on literature. It's called On Literatures. It's a collection of essays on books and writers. And I quote Maugham here. He says, "On one occasion, Matisse was showing a lady a picture of his in which he had painted a naked woman. And the lady exclaimed, 'But a woman isn't like that!' To which Matisse answered, 'It isn't a woman, madam, it is a picture.'" Beautiful way of closing off that chapter on representation. The second point that we identified, of course, is that linked to the idea of representation is a question of interpretation. And here is, of course, a very deep problem, but one question is, well, is there an additional meaning beyond the one that I immediately perceive? So I see two stallions, as we saw last time, two stallions fighting. Is there any additional meaning, or should I just take this painting as a pure representation of two horses? Should the work of art be interpreted in its relation to larger concepts, to universal themes, for example? That is, in a way, does the work need to have a meaning, a profound meaning? Can we not have art just for the sake of art, without interpretation, without additional meaning? Must art have a message? And that's a really thorny question as well. Of course, people would love for art to have a meaning. Others say that artists should not participate in social life in that sense. It reminds us of Earl, who wrote a little book on Beckett, and he says, if Hamlet, the Shakespeare play of course, if Hamlet is about anything, it is really about Hamlet and his particular situation. It is not about the human condition. Highly debatable statement, of course. Many people want to see human nature in all those works of art, but it is a really real question. In the Jackson Pollock painting, you may see Jackson Pollock's soul or his human condition, but you may not see, and perhaps do you have no right to expect to see, human condition with a capital H. Van Gogh, I quote again from his letters to his brother, his letters in general. He says, "I adore the figures by Michelangelo. Although the legs are far too long, the hips and the backsides too large. For me, Millet and him are the real artists, for the very reason that they do not paint things as they are, but as they feel them." Beautiful, beautiful way of concluding this second video. Of course, if you like this, and if you like the first one, thank you for liking and subscribing. It's wonderful. And of course, commenting. I was happy with that as well. We'll come back to that subject and we'll talk more about literature next time. In the meantime, thank you very much. Bye-bye.